Garnora, on cortege no Tuktron. Targig, arm. Garnora, Umfreg, arm. Garnora, clean egg, arm. Garnora, a gumpy clay, umpy. Garnora, Kutus Kumar, Marshall.
A Gwinusil, Liverhull, Biggie Vershassiv, August Faltigi Rove, Uchtron na Hearn, Mihaldi O'Higgin, August Van Kela, Saivin de Higgin. Ladies and gentlemen, please be upstanding to welcome the President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins, and his wife, Sabina Higgins. Agwina Usul, ladies and gentlemen, you may be seated. Agwina Usul, I now invite the Mayor of Limerick, John Moran, to make his welcome remarks.
Uchtron na Hearn, Michael O'Higgin, Van Kela, Sabina Higgin, Ara, Coraltina, Horactus, Corlori, Ambassador, Reverend Luis Marino Montebayo, Nuncio Apostol, Dean na Corpora Diplomaicta, agus Coraltina Corpora Diplomaicta, Tugori Crediv, Irina Ushla, Accorda, to Voltoroif Galer and Shaw Inov. It is a great honour and privilege for me to welcome you here today for the National Famine Commemoration. As Mayor of Limerick, on my own behalf and on behalf of the people of Limerick, I would especially like to welcome you to one of our most historic and picturesque towns, Gilmallock, with its medieval tradition, a place that has worked its way into my own heart, as I'm sure it will yours, since I got to know its amazing communities better during the election last year. Today, however, we remember a dark period in our history, the Great Famine that changed Ireland forever and continues to influence us even up to this day. This ceremony represents an opportunity for us to pause, to reflect and to take time to remember our past and our journey to today. Like counties all over Ireland, Limerick was not spared. Indeed, it was one of the most acutely affected by this Great Famine. An estimated 50,000 people died due to starvation and disease, while another 50,000 were forced to leave their homes and forge new lives overseas. As a result, the population of Limerick declined by 21% during this period, from 330,000 to 262,000 in just 10 years to 1851. Those that emigrated as a result of the Great Famine or afterwards, however, contributed to the worldwide Limerick diaspora that is today about 3 million strong, including the family of world leaders like John F. Kennedy himself, who their family left their homes during famine times right up the road in Bruff. We are gathered today in Kilmallock's Famine Memorial Park, the site of the Kilmallock Union Workhouse, where the full horror of the stories behind those statistics was played out. This park was opened in June 1999 by the then President Mary McAleese, and I would like to take this opportunity to commend and thank the organising committee and their families whose sterling efforts back then gave us the Memorial Park. In particular, Mr. William Parkinson, chair of that committee, and Mr. Pat Gubbins, who are here with us today. I would also like to thank all the volunteers and our own staff at Limerick City and County Council who made such a special effort to have the park looking so spectacular today. It's hard for us to imagine. Thank you. It's perhaps hard for us to imagine in a successful Ireland what time was like back then. The workhouse was opened in 1841 with a capacity for 800, but due to extreme pressure, eventually housed 1,200 people. Such was the ongoing pressure for spaces that more workhouses and fever hospitals had to be opened nearby, such as in Bruff, Ballylanders, Galbally, Garrynoe and Bury. By the end of 1848, despite providing relief to 3,500 people, malnutrition and disease were rife and took their toll. It is believed that 1,500 people died. 1,500 people who did not survive are buried in this park right here to my right. But today, as we commemorate them and all who died during the Great Famine, we also have an opportunity to reflect on what we have achieved as a nation. We have gained our independence, peace on our island, and a lasting, stable, democratic state, able to confidently take its place with the other nations of the world. Here too in Limerick, we echo that journey. We are proud of our long traditions of sport, literature, music and performing arts, which have blended with our long industrial and business heritage to create one of the most desirable places to live in a modern Europe. Now, often at these events, I have the pleasure of welcoming visiting dignitaries, and indeed I do welcome all of our visiting dignitaries today. But it is an even greater pleasure that I welcome to Kilmallock to host the National Famine Commemoration, two of our own today. Our Limerick representative at the Cabinet table, Minister Patrick O'Donovan, TD, and fellow Limerick man, President Michael D. Higgins. I would also like to take the opportunity to acknowledge and thank the members of the National Famine Commemoration Committee for their work in developing the concept of an annual National Famine Commemoration and for ensuring that the victims of the famine are appropriately remembered. But today we remember not just those victims, but all in the world who visibly on our TV screens and phone screens continue to suffer the evils of famine and starvation. Even in our own county, despite our success, there are unacceptable levels of poverty, particularly child poverty. On their behalf, I commit myself and I call on all of our local representatives, our government, and governments all over the world to do more to alleviate their private and silent suffering. In closing, I would like to thank the staff at Limerick City and County Council, particularly the culture team and the team at the Municipal District in Kilmallock, for their wonderful contribution to making this event a success. I would particularly thank and like to welcome our Defence Forces, the Garda Síochána, our civil defence, local music performers and readers and all the volunteers who will help enrich today's event. Finally, I would especially like to thank the community in Kilmallock who have made this event and this commemoration their own. By doing so, you hold the past generations in your mind and, more importantly, in your hearts. Cur míle maith go léir.
I now invite the Minister for Arts, Culture, Communications, Media and Sport, Mr. Patrick O'Donovan TD, to give his welcome address.
Uachtarán a bhéire mar carthaoirleach Christian náisiúnta Cuoinechan an Gorta Mhór is mór an ordum fáilte choróibh go léir chuig Parc Cuoinechan an Gorta Mhór I Gilbheach Lóg imachún de Gúchas agus chuig Cuoinechan náisiúnta an Gorta Mhór Féife Cuig. I would like to start by welcoming the President of Ireland, Michael E. Higgins, and Sabina Higgins, who will lead the official representation during today's event. I would also like to acknowledge all attending today, the Mayor of Limerick, ministers, Oireachtas members, councillors, His Excellency the Most Reverend Luis Marino Montemayor, Apostolic Nuncio and Dean of the Diplomatic Corps, and members of the Diplomatic Corps, religious leaders, ladies and gentlemen. This is the first time that the National Famine Commemoration has taken place in Limerick. We come here to honour and remember all those who suffered, perished and emigrated during or because of the Great Irish Famine. It is fitting that this event is being held here in the grounds of the Kilmallock Workhouse, next to the graveyard where so many of our forebears who died during this time were laid to rest in a mass grave, neighbour with neighbour. There is no other event in the history of our nation that compares to the Great Famine, either for its immediate devastating impact or for its lasting legacy. We are all aware of the terrible statistics. Over 1 million people died from hunger and hunger-related diseases, and over 1 million people were forced to immigrate. Behind each of these statistics was a tragedy, stories of immense suffering, loss, and the courage of those who survived, those who struggled to protect their families, and those who left all that was dear to them to try and forge new lives in foreign lands. The response at the time of the Westminster-based government was totally and wholly inadequate. Rooted in contemporary laissez-faire economics, it prioritised market conditions over the suffering and death of so many Irish people. It also had a devastating impact on our native language, as many of those who died and emigrated were Irish speakers. This contributed hugely to the decline in the use of Irish in the 19th century, which in turn separated us from so much of our heritage and our culture, our stories and our songs. It is important to recall also that many of those who participated in the independence movement in Ireland in the early years of the last century were the sons and daughters of the famine generation. In that sense, the Great Famine was not only the most significant historical event of the 19th century in Ireland, but was also a key contributor to the growing desire to control our own destiny and our own affairs. At a local level, we all know how the famine ripped apart the fabric of communities. And today we remember especially the people of Kilmallock. 1 in 4 people perished or immigrated from this town between the years of 1841 and 1851. These people are not just statistics. They were a community. They were fathers, mothers, husbands, wives, brothers, sisters, and neighbours. They would have walked familiar streets, lined with many of the buildings and the structures we passed here today. And through their stories, we get a sense of the real magnitude and the suffering in the communities, not only here in Kilmallock, but all across the country. They would have come here to the workhouse, seeking refuge and shelter. And today it stands as an impressive, formidable structure, but also a stark reminder of the suffering and loss of our people. For many, their journey ended here, and they were laid to rest in a mass grave in these very grounds. And today we remember each one of them and everyone who lost their lives during this terrible tragedy in Ireland. How fitting that school children across the nation observed a minute of silent reflection in their memory on Friday and at the beginning of all sporting events to be held this weekend. Kilmallock Union Workhouse would have been a place that was dreaded and feared. It is so appropriate that this area of the workhouse has been transformed by the community into a beautiful place of gathering, of peace and of reflection. The monument established by a local committee as a reminder of past suffering, but also a symbol of our perseverance and our resolve and the ability of a community and a nation to overcome great adversity and again flourish. But it is also a permanent promise that we should never, ever forget. We have all been shaped by these events from our past. The famine has shaped our country. It shaped our towns, our communities, and even our landscape. But it has shaped us too as a people. We are now defined as a nation for our spirit of empathy, of generosity, of compassion, especially to those that are suffering from hunger and disease and poverty. The people of Gaza, of Sudan, of Haiti and Mali, we stand with all of these communities. This is the only way that we can truly honour the victims of the past, especially the Great Irish Famine. Marokal score, Guim Buikas le Gachtene, addressler an imak seo inniuv, agus Guim Buikas o Cree le siúd a dagrige, Christa náisiúnta Cuinachan an Gorta Vór, Cor le Carach agus Cunde Limní, Ifig na Naibrike Paibli, agus Ranna na Rialta Sele, agus Gaharathe, Muinter agus Phobal Kilvocalog, agus Gachtene atá bailthe an seo chun an Cuinachan seo a céilúra. Mar ara Rialtas, Guim Gachra or if Goléir, go míle maithagah.
Agwina Usul, I now invite the President, Michael D. Higgins, to address us. Aughteran.
Where build in Arachtas, Corlori, a Guinea Eliog, or Cohoire Heilshe, Luis Mariano Montemayor, den Corps Diplomatique, we venida, esta ocasión especial de Kente Herod. Representatives of the National Famine Commemoration Committee, Koja Ileg. It was a great privilege to have been asked to give the keynote address on this occasion, because today, designated as National Famine Commemoration Day, is a solemn opportunity for the people of this island to reflect on and recall those who perished. Recall, too, the suffering and loss experienced by our Irish people in that cataclysmic period in our history to which we refer to as an Gorta Mór. As you have heard, no other event in our history can be likened to the Great Famine for its immediate tragic impact or for its role in creating a massive increase in a desperate involuntary emigration, cultural loss, for example, its increased pressure for the decline of the Irish language, and a general demoralisation of Irish shared life. It is important that we bring truth to what we do about the famine if we are to use its experience most valuably in the interests of humanity. The founding of a commemorative event for the Great Famine was a significant milestone in itself, and it owes a great deal to those advocates those activists who advocated for it, such as Michael and Olivia Blanche, Pete St. John, Kieran Toohey, and so many others. And as we gather in the Famine Memorial Park within the historic Kilmallock Union Workhouse Complex, this is, as you have heard, the first time that the state commemoration is taking place in County Limerick. And it is a site, I believe, that is most appropriate backdrop for reflecting on one of the most pivotal and painful chapters of our nation's history. You have heard some of the facts already. The basic facts are that the population of Ireland was reduced from 8.5 million in 1845 to 6.6 million by 1851. Over 1 million people died of starvation and disease. Over 2 million people emigrated on approximately 5,000 ship sailings. Life expectancy fell from over 38 years in 1845 to below 21 years in the second half of the decade. We have, thanks to an ever-expanding historiography now, a number of established and accepted facts pertaining to Ungurta Mór. It was a cataclysmic event experienced by the Irish people, then part of the British Empire. Indeed, an apology for the British response was issued on behalf of the British government and read at a commemorative event in Mill Street in 1997, the 150th anniversary of 1847. Having given the keynote address at National Famine commemorations on 6 occasions, this is my 7th. I do so in 2025 for what will be my final time as Uachtaráin na hÉireann. But doing so presents me with the greatest difficulties because of our current circumstances. Famine is a horrific reality in so many parts of the world, repeated again and again, accepted by too many with indifference. The occurrence of repeated famines surely is a great human failure. We are now seeing starvation being used as an instrument of war, as people in countries such as Yemen and Sudan suffer hunger and famine created by conflict. So many additional deaths are caused by blockages to the food and medical aid that they need. The consequences of a forced starvation in Gaza, for example, are daily on our television screens. In relation to Gaza, United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres stated with passion, and I think some despair recently, as aid dries up, the floodgates of horror have reopened. Gaza is a killing field, and civilians are in an endless death loop. The Secretary General went on to draw the world's attention to the breaches of international law involved, to the 4th Geneva Convention, which outlaws the duties of an occupying power to ensure food and medical supplies for the population, as well as ensuring and maintaining medical and hospital establishments and services, public health and hygiene. The Irish government, with others, is asking all of the members of the European Union to act together to avoid what will be, what is now facing us as I speak, a massive loss of life. The collapse in humanitarian aid and assistance across the globe has left a significantly reduced humanitarian capacity. And where it exists at all, access to those affected is impacted by conflict and often civil strife. As I meet you, trucks with vital food, medicine and water are blocked at 3 entry points to Gaza. 2 sets of Irish aid are located in Amman and Jordan and cannot have access. Hunger and displacement are among the greatest challenges facing the world. At their root, of course, may be the impact of climate change, which is contributing not only to immediate conditions of famine, but also to the ability of breaking and limiting food dependence in the future. And that phrase, food dependence, is important. Food dependence means being free to meet your food needs without relying on the surpluses of others indefinitely. It is when we acknowledge the assumptions and the related indifference that stands behind the facts that are the experience of those we see dying on our television screens. And it is when we speculate on the full impact of the ideological context that is coming to dominate, and its influence on policy, and its implications for any morality, that we experience, that we are best prepared to use our own famine experience in such a way as might generate an appropriately ethical response to the obscenity of recurring famines in our own time, in different parts of our shared vulnerable planet, and the assumptions that are responsible. What stands behind the insufficiency of response, the disgraceful insufficiency of response from so many of the powerful? The historiography of the Irish famine I decided I would refer to in my final address. It's historiography like that of the War of Independence and the Civil War. And my father was here at the Cork No. 2 Brigade during the War of Independence and the attack on Kilmallock's barracks. But there was a time when we suggested maybe we should drop all memory. But we cannot drop our memory, particularly in relation to the famine. There was pressure to pass it over, to move on to contemporary constitutional issues and what we have achieved. Indeed, the historiography of the famine was marginalised until the mid-1990s, when scholars such as James Donnelly, Kirby Miller, Patrick O'Sullivan, Cormac O'Grotha, Christine Keneally, Garrod O'Toohick, Thomas Kennelly, and others all helped to give the famine its thorough and appropriate treatment in Irish historiography. Most importantly, the most serious scholarship on the Irish famine has now agreed that the primary contextual features that influenced the response to the famine were based on ideological and political assumptions that carried a particular view of emerging modernity and rationality, seen as an inevitable view of the future, which was perceived as being beyond the Irish people and upon which they needed instruction. This is reflected not just in the writings of politicians, but, for example, in the campaigns of Archbishop Richard Whately and leading economic theorist of the time, Nassau Senior. And we're all indebted to scholars such as Professor Tom Boylan and Dr. Ciara Boylan, who have produced invaluable work on the Whately project. The ideological assumptions of Whately and those such as Nassau Senior have been, of course, critiqued, and in those excellent entries of the famine folios kept at Quinnipiac University, Death by Discourse, Political Economy and the Great Irish Famine by Tyg Foley, he gave us examples of Whately's easy lessons on money matters for the use of young people. Such work exposes the iron fist barely concealed behind the invisible hand of the market. For example, Nassau Senior speculating on whether the act of providence he saw in the famine would be sufficient to change the Irish in the direction of a necessary and altered rationality that accepted the marketplace, stated that, I quote, "The death of only 1 million people in Ireland will scarcely be enough to do much good." As Tyg Foley put it, English establishment during the time of the famine attributed the catastrophe it constituted to moral flaws in the Irish character, such as improvidence, backwardness, indolence, a tendency towards disorder and lawlessness, overpopulation, factors considered to be barriers to economic progress, modernisation, in effect to Anglicisation, the causes and effects of a flawed people. It demonstrated a perceived widespread ignorance of laissez-faire economics on the part of the Irish, which by the mid-19th century, such a philosophy had attained a scientific supremacy in the hegemonic discourse. In 1847, William Neilson Hancock offered 3 lectures on the questions: should the principles of political economy be disregarded in the present crisis? The answer was an unequivocal no. In fact, reading the early contributions to the Journal of the Statistical Society, it becomes obvious that that society was founded not so much as a humanitarian response to the famine, but in order to defend the laws of economics, then seen as being under unprecedented attack. Perhaps the most insightful quotation that helps to explain the prevailing ideology of the time, one that combined providentialism with free market economics, is that of Edmund Burke, who spoke of the laws of commerce, which are the laws of nature, and consequently the laws of God. Recent work on the philanthropic donations during the famine are now very extensive. Such donations as came from, among others, the convicts of the prison hulks, the Choctaw and the Cherokee, peoples on their reservations, the newly freed slaves in the Caribbean, Quakers, all the different indigenous communities in Canada, including the Huron-Wendat people. Recent research from Dr. Jason King and Professor Mark McGowan of the University of Toronto has unearthed writings from individuals in the First Nations of West Canada, which included handwritten notes from the mid-1840s, in which they write, and it's interesting, of how very sorry they are that the children of the Great Mother, who they consider their brothers and sisters in Ireland, are suffering. Universally, they are distressed and empathetic, writing of how they would have given more money, but they themselves are poor. These are people who had virtually nothing, and yet were willing to forego what little they had, having borne similar pain themselves in their own past. They share a sense of the collective, of a shared ancient hospitality in their culture. This research unearths evidence that had been suppressed by governments and by the church, both of whom feared the consequences of such acts of shared hospitality and generosity becoming public knowledge. It would lead to an ideology for action, especially by marginalized groups. The famine in Ireland, then, and indeed those famines elsewhere, including India, can be seen as a collision between the assumptions of ancient human versions of hospitality in relation to necessities and a late 19th century extreme individualism. It is a contest of the universalizing ambitions of an individualism versus diverse versions of a shared humanistic collective. Before the famine, too, and long after, land and its use, its ownership, was a basic issue. And it needs to be recognized that large-scale evictions preceded the famine, continued during the famine, and succeeded it. Before the famine and for long after, as I've said, land was a basic issue. And during the famine, before the famine, during the famine and succeeding it, large-scale evictions were continuing. Ciarán O'Murchu gives us an example appropriate for the setting in which I give this paper. And this will interest Limerick people, the city in which I was born myself, giving evidence later to a British Parliament select committee inquiring into the famine. Francis Spate, I remember it well, a Limerick merchant and ship owner, stated, "I found so great an advantage of getting rid of the pauper population upon my own property that I made every possible exertion to remove them. I consider the failure of the potato crop to be the greatest possible value in one respect, in enabling us to carry out the immigration system." Spate, who had purchased a 4,200-acre North Tipperary estate called Derry Castle, was the owner also of 6 small vessels, which would carry a high proportion of those sent out of Ireland onto the high seas. Spate was a well-known proponent of so-called landlord-sponsored immigration, attracted by the large profits to be made by replacing the ballast on the outward journey with paying emigrants. As Ciarán O'Murrocha has written, during 1847, 85,000 people were recorded as having experienced emigration in this fashion. There is, of course, a deeper layer of history associated with the contest for land and what it might produce. Spate was one of about 10,000 landlords whose ancestors had been the beneficiaries of a 17th century confiscation of lands that transferred almost the entire land stock of Ireland from Irish Catholics to British Protestants. However, a great gulf divided the wealthiest 50 or so landlords, mostly titled English absentees, from those such as Spate with relatively modest holdings, typically about 2,000 acres, who found themselves obliged to supplement their rental income from other sources in order to sustain a lifestyle that would not otherwise have been possible. As to the response, and this is where we are, of An Garta Mór, the development of workhouses and institutions related to them, the conditions associated with entry to them, the worst that were defined as requiring to be worse than the worst conditions outside, have been the subject of early work such as that of the late Dr. Francis Finnegan, who shone a light on the assumptions of the workhouses as a project of poverty. And there are now very substantial accounts of the dying, impoverished Irish response to the workhouse. For those who sought to avoid the workhouse, very many of them found the requirements of the public work schemes beyond their capacity, owing to their weakness that came from hunger. Those involved in public works reflect, O'Murrocha tells us, the varying levels of destitution. At the height of their operation in March 1847, public works were crucial for the survival of 734,000 labourers who toiled on them daily, and to their families who together comprised a total dependency of 3 million persons. As O'Murrocha has written, public works employment was skewed towards counties in the west and south, which of course reflects the imbalances in suffering. The daily average numbers of persons employed in counties Cork, Galway and Limerick were 42,000, 33,000 and 26,000 respectively. In Down and Antrim, and there is an issue about land there, had figures of 335 and 270, reflecting a far lesser extent of destitution and different land arrangements. James Donnelly, Cormac O'Grotha, Christine Keneally, Patrick O'Sullivan continued and broke such important ground in relation to Irish historiography. But one of the most recent is Padraig Scanlon's work, and he puts the Irish famine in a context that includes conquest, colonisation, and dispossession. Scanlon writes of how the socio-economic and political system was one shaped by conquest and colonialism, and fatally for the poor. And we must learn from this for today by a conviction that austerity in the market would deliver progress. The legacies of conquest and colonialism, addressed by a deep imperial faith in markets, commerce, and capitalism as the only remedies for social problems, even amid the most catastrophic ecological and economic collapses. This, he suggests, produced what he calls the most rotten policies. When we assess the causes of the famine, the word rotten is one that is omnipresent. The rotten potatoes that resulted from Fiftaforia infestans, the blight that ravaged Europe's potatoes from 1845, starting in Belgium, having been imported in 1843 from the United States as tubers for planting a seed in 1844. The rotten policies that, as far as Ireland was concerned, were Westminster's disastrous response to the Irish famine, and the rot before the rot, the socio-economic, political, and ideological assumptions and systems that by the 1840s had made the poor vulnerable to disaster. The Irish famine was but one of the 19th century British Empire's many famines. Imperialism itself, imposing demands upon a society, disrupting the natural indigenous development of societies, expanding beyond its strength and understanding, is inextricably linked with famine around the colonised world, and perhaps most notably in India and Ireland. Garrod O'Toohig's seminal contribution, Ireland Before the Famine, showed how the imperialist forces predating the famine gave rise to economic catastrophe, over-dependence on potatoes, poor living standards, land tenure insecurity, all of which precipitate and cause the calamity that is the famine. But what kind of world was it? And we don't too often hear about it. At that time, just under 4,000 people owned 80% of Irish land. Around 2,000 owned 93% of Scotland. Approximately 5,000 owned more than half of England. And 700 owned 60% of Wales. These figures are not accidental, they are important structural contributors to what happened in the Irish famine and elsewhere. In Britain, large landlords rented their land to wealthier farmers who in turn rented hundreds of acres and employed labourers. In Ireland, the average farm was a large farm was 50 to 100 acres, with rent often equal to the entire value of saleable produce. In 1845, 505,000 farmers, that's a third, accounting for 1.75 million people when you put the dependents in, they leased plots of less than 10 acres. Poorest of all were the 650,000 landless labourers, and their dependents, which amounted to 2.7 million people. That was a quarter of the population, seeking Connacher whenever they could. The poorer the province, the more intense the subdivision. In Munster here, Limerick and Clare, 1/3 of the rural population lived on a half-acre plot or less of potato-growing land. In Connacht, 44,000 farms out of a total of 46,000, that's 95%, were under 15 acres. But the consequences of the famine fell most severely on the landless labourers as a class. The class of Cosher and Connacher farmers shrank from 134,000 in 1841 to 36,000 a decade later. They are gone and they are dead. The number of holdings under 5 acres fell from 440,000 to 124,000. A land model dominated by landlords, moneylenders, and speculators epitomised an extractive capitalism with its aversion to communal welfare. And of course, land hunger would remain a constant in Irish rural society. As late as 1917, of the 572,574 holdings in Ireland, 112,787 were less than 1 acre, and 123,000 holdings were between 15 and 30 acres. I think interesting to know, by the time of the famine, the Irish economy was overwhelmingly agricultural. Out of 14 million acres under cultivation, out of a land area of 20.2 million acres. 1841, the census tells us that only 32% of males were engaged in non-agricultural employment. So there was just the linen industry in Ulster, which had been in decline since 1800, and employment anywhere other than on land was not an achievable option. The changes that were taking place by clearances and evictions were having a devastating effect on the poorest, who experienced an enforced dependence on a single source of food, the potato. The number of evictions grew during the famine, 11,166 in 1847 to 16,900 in 1849. I want to say something that has been neglected as I finished in that, and that is about the famous Reverend Dr. Thomas Nulty, Bishop of Meath, who in his contribution back to the land, published in the United States in 1887, sold 1 million copies, and he said, Nulty, Irish landlordism of the 19th century, he said, was based on a claim to absolute property rights, according to quit made tenants dependent. I quote him, for the right of earning their bread on the farms which their forefathers enriched with their toil, on the arbitrary and irresponsible will of their landlords, who perceived not even the most basic obligation to keep them from dying of want. Nolte was resolute in his opposition to the idea of an absolute right to property on land without responsibility. I infer that no individual or class of individuals can hold a right of private property in the land of a country, that the people of that country in their public corporate capacity are and always must be the real owners of the land of that country. So I think in of it all, most recently, James Joyce in Ulysses makes reference to Bishop Nolte, but Luke Ribbons has written of him. In the shrill discourse of the period, it is not surprising that Nolte's essay drew charges of being communistic from the London Times, and its international publication in Patrick Ford's Irish World newspaper. That's it. This emphasis, as argued by Nolte, decades after Garth Moore on subsistence and socioeconomic rights, it offered a defiant challenge to the prevailing political economy of the period. Very, very much decades earlier, Malthus and his followers considered the Irish situation of the 1840s as hopeless, believing that fixed laws of nature constituted the only means by which God's progressive purpose could be achieved on earth. And with such a theology in mind, the arrival of the famine was seen as evidence of the disapproval by divine sources of overpopulation, and thus necessary to annihilate surplus population. This sense of providentialism. I think Charles Trevelyan, the senior British Treasury official in charge of famine relief, in his 1848 book, The Irish Crisis, offered us the following. What a direct stroke of an all-wise and all-merciful providence, the sharp but effectual remedy by which the cure is likely to be effected, one which lays bare the deep and inveterate root of social evil. God grant that the generation to which this great opportunity has been offered may rightly perform its part. It is thus the role of laissez-faire economics is critical in any description of the causes of Garth Moore. And while all this was going on, agricultural exports from Ireland to Britain had been increasing for decades. Wheat exports increased in 1800 from 749 quarters to 661,776 quarters on the eve of the famine. 85% of the imported grain of Britain, meat, butter, and livestock during the 1840s came from Ireland. By the end of 1846-7, an estimated 400,000 people had died of starvation and disease. Children watched their parents die and were too weak to move their bodies. And it would be very dishonest of me if I didn't say how I cannot dispassionately wonder how television audiences are watching parents watching their children die and be emaciated and malnourished as they are now in so many parts of the world. As well as those who starved, others died of malnutrition, others died because of a failure to adjust to a diet of maize. But I think, despite the fact as well, whatever the disadvantages of maize, the fact that it was providing food for up to 3 million people meant that the closing down of the soup kitchens after just 6 months from March to September of 1847 had a huge effect. The British government had allocated £8 million to the project, and it is interesting that in the same period they had allocated 20 million for compensating the owners of slaves after the abolition of slavery. These policies too, and I think particularly the quarter acre clause, which required people to cinder all but a quarter of an acre of the ground without entering the workhouse, were all aspects of the consequences of a predominant kind of economics. Richard Townsend, who devoted his time in Skibbereen and Schull to the care of the poor, of the poor, spoke of, in his area, 50% of the people had died, and he was one of the first to lay the blame on the economic theories guiding it. To finish, we are, as you have heard, speaking in Kilmarnock Famine Memorial Park, the site for this year's National Famine Commemoration, built on a burial ground where many famine victims, mostly undocumented, were laid to rest in mass graves. The park contains the Kilmallock Union Workhouse, erected in 1839-40. It is one of 163 workhouses that once operated across Ireland. And the conditions were similar. Designed by the Poor Law Commissioners to house 800 people. It contained 1,397 at the peak of the famine, and it was operating at 75% above its capacity. In the final 12 weeks of 1848, 230 people died in that workhouse. Doctors reporting from Limerick report in the Limerick Chronicle that people left with no other food were in either extreme hunger, forced to eat diseased and rancid potatoes, leading to calamitous results, including smallpox. The population of Limerick, as you heard, declined, as you have heard. But going back to a man I mentioned earlier, this time of blight and hunger, the Limerick city quaysides were used to transport produce from one of the most fertile parts of Ireland, the Golden Vale, to the English ports. And Francis Spate, the Limerick merchant, landlord and owner of 6 vessels, recorded 386,909 barrels of oats, 46,288 barrels of wheat, shipped out of Limerick between June 1846 and May 1847. The same Limerick quaysides were the departure point for those attempting to flee the famine, sailing across the week. 1 week in April 1850 saw 4 ships, the Mary Brennan, Congress, the Triumph and Hannah, the smallest immigrant ship, sailed down the Shannon towards the Americas, mostly young people on board. The Hannah at 18 metres could hold 60 passengers and 8 crew, and yet it made 8 transatlantic voyages. As many as 40,000 people, 20% of all the immigrants during 1847, died on the voyage. 5,000, I think, as well, of those who left were also deported for political reasons, of those Thomas Kennelly's Great Shame has written. When they arrived, in 1850, Margaret Carty sent $20 to her father in Kanturk, which she hoped might be some acquisition to you, until you might be clearing away from that place altogether. She expressed happiness at being away from where the county ratesman would have the satisfaction of impounding her cow or other possessions. I finished then by saying, I have said at the beginning of what I had to say, that I find it very, very difficult. I remain convinced, and it is something that is indeed I had discussed many, many times with Pope Francis, indeed, about the connection between economics, justice, ecology, respect to nature, about the need to do it differently. And my point about, for example, meeting the needs of hunger, which are short of the needs of breaking food dependency. Different cultures in the history of humanity have fed themselves in different ways. And all the cultures tell us about what they share, even when they have very little, as the messages that came to us in the famine tell us. Therefore, when we hear about, for example, I was in Somalia in 1992, and afterwards my predecessor, Mary Robinson, was told in the United Nations, never again, never again. And yet the decision to put wheat into the market economy meant that we couldn't any longer find out information on who held what, in other words, to prepare and prevent against future famines. But it ends, and this is the point, what we will find even in responding, those who live, will find that when you will be asked in many ways to revive an old system of meeting global hunger through commercial structures led by multinationals which are about disposing of surpluses, when what is needed, a connection between economy, justice, ecology, respect for nature, and enable people to exercise choice on how they break food dependence. And that is a matter of sovereignty. Hunger is at the heart of the involuntary mass migration which we now see, and for which we have such a poor response. We are witnessing breaches and challenges to human rights around the world. The existential challenges that face us today: global hunger, malnutrition, poverty, sustainability, war, and preparations for war. At a time when we are losing support for the international institutions of the United Nations, they require us to accept the challenge of seeking a new enhanced consciousness, a new point of balance, resonance, agreement as to giving primacy, managing and sustaining the means of survival itself. But any new beginning must be one that seeks to build the mind and the experience of peace, recognizes the interdependence of a shared humanity, aspires towards achieving a recognition that war must never be an option, and that a global peaceful coexistence is an expression of our shared humanity. That to actually reply to violence with violence is a great, great disaster. And when the Security Council fails us, as it does again and again, in responding to what I have been describing as the current conditions, we must return to the exceptional measures that are available to us, that I remember discussing at the time of the Iraq War, that are available from the General Assembly. The General Assembly must speak and act if, in fact, the Security Council refuses to deal with the terrible famines that are now facing us in those parts of the world. But most importantly, and it is good and wonderful, I pay tribute to all those people I have continued to meet not only in Ireland but elsewhere, who see the great value of peace, who see the possibilities of fulfillment, and who also saw the joy, and they saw what a great expression of humanity as a species it is, that they will say, we have very little, but what we have, we share. I think in this case, and in many cases, it becomes so important to never slide over the famine, but to take the famine and learn from it and examine its assumptions and use it as part of our critique of what we have a moral responsibility now to achieve. I repeat my plea that we all work together for a lasting peace, for an end that will give us our best prospect for an end to global hunger and famine. Ma mille fuicas liv as ar faidje eerste club. Is bergach pana tantaki. Die veeniges na klange ziet sang ta braere. Ma fuicas liv. Karamage.
Is mór a gwyn na focus bregúla sin a Uachtarán. A gwyn úsal, ladies and gentlemen, Liam Flanagan will now perform a musical piece titled The Lament for Staker Wallace. Gwina Usul, ladies and gentlemen, pupils of Skull Mackilog, AJ Brosnan and Hazel Gorman will now recite Trinity by Flann O'Connor.
I am the famished one.
No manna from the iron skies.
I am the one in fever.
No one comes near.
I am the proud one.
Gathering nettles at night.
I am the homeless one.
Finding shelter in ditches.
I am the lost one.
Shouting in the bog at night.
I am the despairing one.
Dumbstruck.
I am the dying one.
Bones brittle as small birds.
I am the dead one.
Burnt in lime.
Gwina Usul, ladies and gentlemen, Slán na Bhaig, Mornin's Return and the Ruins of Kilmallock will be performed by Sean O'Farrell, Ciara Flanagan and Liam Flanagan. Gwina Usul, ladies and gentlemen, pupils of Colashta Joseph, Aoife Kennedy and Cian Gleeson will read a letter from Dr. Morgan David O'Connell to Kilmallock Board of Guardian from 1847.
Letter by Dr. Morgan David O'Connell to the Kilmallock Board of Guardians, published in the Limerick Chronicle newspaper on the 5th of May, 1847. Dr. O'Connell was medical officer of the Kilmallock Workhouse. He was a cousin of the liberator, Daniel O'Connell. His unceasing labour on behalf of the suffering people, his solicitous and sympathetic attitude towards the poor and the sick, and his constant endeavour to bring the scale of the calamity he was witnessing to the full notice of the authorities deserves to be remembered on this day. Gentlemen, I beg leave to call your serious attention to the spread of fever in Kilmallock electoral division. There are at present in the main street of Kilmallock 6 poor families in fever, 2 on Stone Road and 2 more in Church Lane, and, dreadful to add, one of these, Mrs. Power, mother of 8 in family, is breathing out pestilence of the most contagious kind on her numerous and truly unfortunate family, who cannot separate themselves or procure admittance into any other house. I have been attending fever and dysenteric patients since the 13th of April, when I made a report to you from the dispensary books of the cases under my care, and I stated for your information that there were then lying sick in the Abbey cloister and in want of bedding and nourishment some unfortunate creatures. I am sorry to again inform you that the numbers have since increased in this abode of misery. 9 poor souls, victims of famine and its consequences, fever and dysentery, are now located there.
The widow Galway. Within the last week, swollen with dropsy herself, sitting on a cold stone over her daughter, raging with fever, and endeavouring to soothe her troubled thoughts and quench with river water her parched tongue. This poor girl is since removed to a more generous and peaceful world, and her poor aunt too, who made some struggle to attend on her, died in the undertaking. The widowed mother is still in the ruins of the abbey, with the cold wind blowing in on her, and on the night of her daughter's burial, the cows of the Abbey farm came in on the helpless creature and ate the small wisp of straw from under her. The other sick patients there are going on as well as may be expected from their misery and wretchedness. It is indeed a sad sight to look on these poor people and not have it in one's power to supply their wants. I hope the board will now do something decisive on this head, as they have the power by law, and that they will take a hospital, appoint sanitary police for removing the patients thereto, and order the town to be lime-washed, and the filth and manure removed from the dwellings of the poor. Otherwise, God only knows where the evil will terminate. I have the honour to be, gentlemen, your obedient servant, Morgan David O'Connell, MD.
Gwina Usul, I now invite Father Damien Farnan, chaplain to the Defence Forces, to lead a prayer for the victims of the famine.
In Alam Lahar ag the Vic ag the Spirit Nave, Amen. Í ahar an ahar, Tommy le chéile chun gui son gacéine for bás, agus dimmic ar imrecha I ré an Gurta Moor. The words of the prophet Isaiah, "Yet, even if these forget, I will never forget you." Lord, it is impossible for us to imagine the feelings of hopelessness, anger and loss experienced by those who suffered through the famine years. But today we want to honour them, the victims of the Great Famine, those who died, those who were forced to emigrate, and those who suffered and survived the greatest tragedy in the history of our country. Lord, as a nation noted for our generosity and hospitality, and as the victims of the Great Famine call on us, may we continue to be inspired by the example of the heroes of the famine to help their modern-day counterparts in their time of need. In a world where the spectre of famine still haunts millions, we pray for all who work tirelessly to promote justice and peace. We remember our missionaries, our peacekeepers, and our NGOs, that the effects of famine may be relieved and its causes eradicated. Lord, we pray for the victims of the Great Famine, our sisters and brothers who died, for those that survived and lived with the scars, for all that emigrated, and all who made our ancestors welcome in foreign lands. May they enjoy forever the love which was denied to them in life. Today, in their memory and conscious of our own woundedness, we ask your help as we strive to be especially sensitive to the needs of all who struggle. May we stand in solidarity this day with all who experience hunger and pain in our world. Amen.
Guard Nora, Greer Clay, Gamar, Marshall. Guard Nora, Raddick, Foe. Guard Nora, Stod. Guard Nora, Amok, P. Guard Nora, Laharv, Own Yesh, Dressy. Guard Nora, Dark Gig, Rife. Guard Nora, Umfrig, Arm. Guard Nora, Shasik, Rosh. Hukra.
Agwina Usul, ladies and gentlemen, the Minister.
Agwina Usle, I now invite President Higgins to unveil the commemorative plaque and to plant a mountain ash in memory of the victims of the Great Famine. I also invite President Higgins thereafter to lay a wreath on behalf of the people of Ireland in memory of those who suffered, died and emigrated during the Great Famine. President Higgins will be accompanied by James and Cuiva from Scull Muckalogue.
Guard Nora, Guard, Ara.
A Uachtarán ara agus a dina úsil eile. Curmid hús in ish leis an tríú cuid de sermonis Cúvnachán na stát don Gortamór. I invite you to now stand for the wreath laying ceremony.
Garnora. Ash Umfraig. Arm. Garnora. Air arm. A Shumpraha. Lee.
Agwina Usul, ladies and gentlemen, a minute of silence will now be observed for all those who have died during the Great Famine.
Guard Nora. Guard. Ara. Guard Nora. Umfraig. Arm. Guard Nora. Taragig. Arm. Garnora. Umfrig, arm. Garnora. Tarragig, arm. Garnora. Umfrig, arm.
Aguina Aguina Isel Ella. This concludes the 2025 National Famine Commemoration Ceremony. On behalf of all here present, may I express our sincere thanks to the President Michael D. Higgins and his wife Sabina Higgins for their presence and their participation in today's National Famine Commemoration Ceremony. Aguina Usel agus Aini Ella. Thank you all for attending today's ceremony. You are all welcome to some light refreshments in Kilmallock Library following the conclusion of the ceremony. I would request that guests remain in their seats or allocated areas until directed and then to follow the directions of the stewards at all times. Gorev Maha Gwivila. Thank you.
Morocco score